Hello, I am Hilliard the Senior Curator of Collections and organizer of this exhibition. For the first time, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts is focusing an exhibition on the sweep of stylistic and cultural developments articulated in printmaking in Germany and Austria from the early history of the medium in the mid-15th century to modern times, from the Gutenberg Bible of 1455 to the 20th century expressionist printmaker Erich Heckel. Selected primarily from the permanent collection of this museum, we also feature several highly important graphics and printed books that have been assembled from such other leading Canadian collections as the National Gallery of Canada and the McGill University Rare Book Library, as well as several outstanding private collections. About 90 works are presented. In addition, several exceptional drawings are among the featured graphics. Several of these works on paper have never been previously exhibited publicly. Others have not been exhibited in recent years. Highly important recent museum acquisitions from all periods are also featured. Let us look now at a selection from among the many works in the exhibition. While papermaking and printing can be traced back to China and the Korean Peninsula in late antiquity, the earliest woodblocks created in Europe for printing on paper can be dated to the late 14th century. By the 1420s, woodcuts appear in the Upper Rhine. Not surprisingly, they are influenced by the emphasis on outlines in contemporary manuscript illustrations. Many were hand-colored with watercolor for sale in market fairs. I compare such a page with a contemporary German illuminated manuscript. In the early 1450s, Johann Gutenberg introduced printed books to Europe in his magnificent Bible, produced with movable metal type and a press, from his shop in Mainz. This replaced earlier block books in which any illustrations and text had to be carved together in a single block. Within a decade, movable type book printing spread throughout Europe. The printed image is in reverse to the block. In contrast to woodcuts, printed in relief from the surface of the block, engraving is a technique in which a design is gouged out with a tool on a metal plate. Early engravings tended to be small, and not surprisingly, the earliest engravers tended to have backgrounds in executing metal ornamentation, such as sword hilts and as goldsmiths. The plate is polished, ink is applied to the plate surface and wiped to be retained only in the grooves created by the tool. If the burr created by the carving is not polished off before inking, a velvety but less precise line is created, which is called dry point. Dampened paper is then applied under pressure of a press, and the image is transferred. Engravings offer the possibility of very fine gradations of lines and encourage more intimate viewing. I show you a 16th century anonymous and hand-colored image of St. Margaret and a late 15th century engraving of the Entombment of Christ by Israel van Meckenem. As in woodcuts, the image is reversed in printing. In 1493, Hartmann Schädel published in German and Latin editions of the Nuremberg Chronicle, a milestone in printed illustrated books. The publication purported to be an historical record of the world up to that time, religiously concluding with the anticipated apocalypse and last judgment. The massive work was illustrated with 645 woodcuts, executed by the local painter and printmaker Michael Wohlgemuth, together with his stepson, Wilhelm Platenworth, and their workshop. The illustrations include images of kings, popes, and other high-ranking individuals. Imagine world landscapes and cityscapes. Wohlgemuth's technical talent was reflected in the fact that he was Dürer's teacher from 1486 to 1490. The greater sophistication in these book illustrations from woodcuts of the mid-15th century is evident in the handling of varying width and character of the lines on the woodblock and the suggestion of shadows, volumes, and textures through parallel lines on the surface of the block, as transferred to the paper illustrations. In turn, The imagery of the Nuremberg Chronicle may have influenced Dürer's own early series of 15 woodcuts, The Apocalypse, dating from 1496 to 1498. And yet, look how far Dürer has advanced in only 3 years. An illustration of the raising of the dead and Last Judgment from the Chronicle is compared to a brilliant pre-publication proof of Dürer's The Beast with Two Horns from his illustrated Apocalypse. Martin Schongauer's exquisite engravings, tremendously influential in his time, transitioned from the efforts of the earliest practitioners of engraving to the Renaissance ideals that would be fully realized in the art of Albrecht Dürer. In the entombment of about 1480, the influence of early Netherlandish masters, including Jan van Eyck, Hugo van der Goes, and Dirk Bouts, reflect the printer-engraver's probable travel to the Flemish Netherlands. A rich pictorialism enters his art, in which the setting of the figures in compositionally harmonized spaces and context profoundly enhances the emotional experience. The figures in these later works are more crowded together, more delicate and elongated, the detailing of their faces conveying their emotional states. He achieves this technically through fine and delicate lines to create shadows and contrasts of light to dark, silhouetting figures. The dominant middle tones, created through closely paralleled thin lines, are unprecedented in printmaking and enhance the tonal unity of the scene portrayed. Albrecht Dürer is arguably the greatest and certainly the most influential artist in the history of German art. Superb printmaker and painter, theoretician, reformer, the artist who first fully brought the innovations of the Italian Renaissance to Northern Europe. This genius was born in Nuremberg in 1471, son of a goldsmith. In 1490, he departed for travel through Germany as well as to Basel and the Netherlands, intending ultimately to study with Martin Schongauer, but the latter had recently died. These travels and his increasing sophistication and exposure to both Flemish artists' use of light and color and Italian solidity of form and perspective were enriched by his study of Mantegna's engravings and the first of 2 trips to Italy, traveling to Venice in late 1494-95. Dürer managed to synthesize the design and idealization of the Northern Italian with a greater sense of specificity of detail and immediacy of Northern art. In the engraving, 4 Naked Women, also known as the 4 Witches, of 1497, based on the classical 3 Graces, adding a 4th figure and suggestions of devilish necromancy, the artist explores the nude, exaggerating the women's bulky bodies, mastering the use of parallel, slanting strokes of changing width, as is found in Mantegna's print. In 1505, just prior to Dürer's second and final trip to Italy, Dürer created one of the greatest examples of engraving in the history of the medium, The Fall of Man, Adam and Eve. Based on his studies of Italian art and art theory, the carefully proportioned figures present idealized humanity, as conceived by God before the fall, against a dark and dense forest. The vigorous Adam holds onto a branch of an ash tree, signifying the tree of life, on which a parrot is perched together with a cartouche bearing Dürer's name, while Eve accepts the fruit from a snake coiled around a fig tree. The surrounding animals are selected for their association with the 4 temperaments, sins, and related diseases, the result of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. In his writings and through his work, Dürer preached the importance of proportion and perspective. More remarkable than the musculature and massive bulk of the animal depicted in the Great Horse, however, is the dramatic foreshortening of its body. The artist has exceeded reality to make his point. Imagine the horse's size if viewed from the side. Between about 1507 and 1512, Dürer worked on a series of 16 engravings depicting the narrative of the Passion, from the arrest to the crucifixion and burial of Christ, in two different techniques, dramatic woodcuts and sumptuously refined engravings. It is possible to see the continued influence of Martin Schongauer, but from the technical point of view, Dürer has greatly surpassed his mentor. The flagellation, with its extremely fine differentiations of engraved lines and stippling, dramatically bodes forth the figure of Christ at a column being viciously scourged before onlookers. Dürer has used a sophisticated knowledge of perspective and anatomy, in which the figures seem in rotation about the column, yet totally naturalistic. These are images created for careful study and contemplation. After a brief period in Vienna, Lucas Cranach the Elder settled in Wittenberg in 1505, where he became court painter to the Saxon Duke Frederick the Wise. Lucas's distinctive, yet Dürer-influenced style made him the outstanding Saxon artist. He had a strong affinity to decorative patterning, evident in his landscapes, in which energized and twisted forms of trees and other natural phenomena enhanced the tension of the subject matter, and his manipulation of the proportions of his figures and use of light to dark contrasts to heighten the emotional impact of his themes. The delicacy of his treatment of female figures may owe something to Venetian influence. The Penance of St. John Chrysostom of 1509 is arguably his masterpiece, with a remarkably sophisticated use of the burin, innovative and widely ranging between short strokes, fluid longer strokes, and evocation of textures as well as the distinctive densities of foliage. The arcane subject of this print reflects a certain enterprising imagination in 15th century Europe to find salacious possibilities, in this case, St. John Chrysostom, who lived about 349 to 414, one of the venerable four Greek fathers of the Church. The figure of St. John, on all fours, can be seen as a small detail in the right background. Albrecht Altdorfer, who dominated the Danube School of Art, lived most of his life in Regensburg in Bavaria. Altdorfer studied under his father, but also traveled in about 1511 south into the Alps. His early printed works reveal his study of both Dürer and of the Venetian printmaker and painter Jacopo da Barbari, an artist popular in the north. Altdorfer was a master of landscape, transmuting the poetry of the Venetian landscape tradition into a northern mystical experience of forests and mountains. Man and nature tend to be intimately united in Altdorfer's world. To some extent, this magical effect is achieved through his dramatic lighting effects within the landscapes, so that we sense figures even in this 1515 engraving of the Virgin and Child in a landscape, or the slightly later Rest on a Flight into Egypt, as part of a greater cosmic order. During the 16th century, book production continued actively throughout Germany. Over 1 million Bibles, as translated into German by Martin Luther, were published in Wittenberg alone. While the 17th century was a transitional epoch in German graphics, it continued to be a very important period of preeminence in the production of illustrated books, as such cities as Frankfurt and Hamburg rose to prominence. Sir William Harvey's profoundly important and rare publication of 1628 on the pumping circulation of blood is notable for his choice of a Frankfurt publisher for this very crucial work in medical history, as he was personal physician to Charles I in England. The fold-out presentation of the application of a tourniquet and exposure of the veins in the arm is a delightful one, but also central to his revolutionary argument for the systematic circulation of blood. Finally, the book by Friedrich Martens on his exploration of Greenland in 1671, published in 1675, includes illustrations on the vicissitudes of travel and local flora and Arctic fauna, but the final plate is truly magnificent in its depiction of whales. Karl Wilhelm Kolbe was active in Berlin and Dessau in the early 19th century, and his landscape etchings and drawings are extraordinary and unique in their vision, reflecting a transition from the study and classical respect for regularity and rationalized formal analysis symptomatic of the German later Enlightenment to the emerging romantic sensibility of inner reality and the expression of the individual's visions. His studies of landscapes and vegetation burst with a sense of uncontrolled organic growth and are as much the products of his own imagination as his study of nature. His unique vision gave birth to his nickname, Eichen, oak, after the gnarled, fantastical oaks that populate some of his prints. This print probably dates to the 1820s. Machart was born in Salzburg and studied at the Academy in Munich from 1860 to 1865. Returning to Austria at the invitation of the Kaiser in 1869, Machart became the most influential painter in Vienna from 1870 until his death in 1884. Responsible for major decorations in the new buildings along the Ringstrasse, theater designs, and instruction as a professor at the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in the capital. He profoundly influenced the next generation of Viennese artists, notably Gustav Klimt. The Abduction, Death and the Maiden, of 1863 reflects his interest in romantic themes that also had musical associations, including Franz Schubert. The subject is a sort of amalgam of a dance of death with erotic undercurrents and has a long history in Germanic imagery. The foreshortened horse of hell leaps into the black chasm of the underworld. Death, his massive cape caught in the wind, is highly defined to enhance the horror, as the maiden sensuously collapses in his grasp, all set against a dark, hovering sky. Gustav Klimt was among the most influential artists of Central Europe in the first third of the 20th century, with profound impact on the later history of design. In 1897, the artist co-founded the artistic group the Vienna Secession and served as its first president. Klimt also designed posters and illustrations. Refinement of design, fluid contours, and the flattening of space through powerful patterning are essential characteristics of his work. Drawings, usually executed in pencil or red pencil, were central to Klimt's working method, and their elegant linearism and fluid contours contribute to their appeal. The study for Adela Bloch-Bauer, too, displays Klimt's recent study of the Fauves and Matisse. Fascinatingly, the face of the subject was of little interest to the artist in the multiple studies on display in the exhibition. Adela Bloch-Bauer was a leading figure in the intellectual life of Austria, both before and after World War I. Her father, Moritz Bauer, was head of one of Vienna's largest banks. The powerful and moving character of Kollwitz's subject matter, dramatically confronting urban poverty and the oppression of the working classes, hunger, war, and depression, associate her in the public imagination with the more stylistically experimental German artists of the next generation, the Expressionists. In this period, her realism was informed by her careful study of the old masters. Early successes were followed by a cycle, Peasant War, including The Outbreak of 1903, a print executed in the techniques of etching and aquatint. It is a work of profound respect for an anonymous, downtrodden, poor woman among the masses, monumentalizing her. Self-portraiture was a central theme of her work, and she produced over 100 in the course of her career. A socialist and pacifist, she was an early supporter of the Weimar Republic. With the rise of National Socialism, her work was judged entartete, degenerate, and stripped from museums. In the self-portrait of 1934, we see a bit of her proper right hand as she stares outward, the face having become an impenetrable, tragic mask of human experience, in Germany in which Adolf Hitler had just risen to power. Kollwitz, who had lost a son in World War I, would lose her grandson on the Eastern Front. Among the central artistic premises of the group Die Brücke, which included such artists as its founder, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Erich Heckel, Emil Nolde, Max Pechstein, and Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, all represented in the exhibition, was the expression of extreme emotion, borrowing from the crudeness, as it was characterized, and directness of so-called primitivist art, notably African sculpture, which the artist very much admired for its perceived sincerity, directness, and honesty to materials, the use of high-keyed colors, and a figuration that was non-naturalistic. Their revolt against bourgeois culture, which they believed was the source of mediocrity and corruption, manifested itself in a style of agitated, heavy lines and vehement color. They also looked at the works of Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach the Elder, among other early Germanic sources. While the woodcut, with its coarse gouges and jagged lines, is most often associated with expressionist prints, the artist also revolutionized the mediums of etching and lithography to vibrant and stark effect. The group disbanded in 1913. In Nolde's Portrait of Ada of 1906 and Kirchner's Nude Young Woman, Seated, of 1907, their Die Brücke aesthetic is clear. During World War I, Erich Heckel served as a medic and created this iconic self-portrait Männerbildnis, Portrait of a Man, in the months after the end of the war. It is one of the foremost images of German Expressionism. Heckel has left visible the basic characteristics of the woodblock in this work's sharp and rugged lines. A process of gouging or hacking away has been employed here. It is as if Heckel has chiseled into his own face the physical ravages of the war and the experience of post-war Berlin. The sickly green manifests the artist's emotional temperament. The ink has been applied with a brush rather than a roller. Such application makes Heckel's face appear all the more pallid and worn. This impression is particularly fresh in its inking. When the First World War erupted, Dix volunteered for the German army and took part in the Battle of the Somme. He was seriously wounded several times. Affected by the sights of the war, he produced a series of drawings and prints that reflected that traumatic experience that profoundly influenced the direction of his subsequent art. This is evident in his 1923 lithograph, Der Blinde, The Blind Man, an impoverished veteran selling matchboxes on the street. Even earlier, Max Beckmann immortalizes the grief of his mother-in-law in 1914 at the outset of the war, upon learning of the death in combat of her only son, the stark dry point print, Weeping Woman. One of the two pioneering movements of German Expressionism, Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, began in Munich as a more abstract counterpart to Die Brücke. Der Blaue Reiter sought to transcend the mundane through the pursuit of the spiritual. The elder Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky, living in Munich, whose 1910 publication Concerning the Spiritual in Art established the guiding principles for the movement, together with the young Franz Marc, were the centers and theoreticians of the group. Central concepts for these artists and others in the group were that color and form conveyed spiritual values. Thus, they were not to be employed in verisimilitude to observation and became increasingly abstracted from forms. Blue was seen as the most spiritual color. The writer alluded to movement forward. Red was associated with brutal materiality, yellow with femininity. Animals in general were considered closer to an innate, natural state of spirituality, and Marc was particularly drawn to horses. He also carefully studied animals at the Berlin Zoo, generalizing their forms from many sketches. The 1911 Almanac contains illustrated essays as well as pochoirs, stencil prints, by both Kandinsky and Marc, I show you that of Mark. In its opening years, immediately after World War I, the movement of Der Blaue Reiter experienced a sort of afterlife at the Bauhaus, literally building house. The latter was an art school organized by Walter Gropius that operated between 1919 and 1933 in Weimar, Dessau, and Bernau. Its goals were different from Der Blaue Reiter, and the latter movement is associated not only with the fine arts, but also with a streamlined design aesthetic in both architecture and utilitarian objects, including industrial and commercial design and typography. Nonetheless, Lionel Feiniger and Vasily Kandinsky were among several Blaue Reiter members who taught at the institution. Feiniger's choice of a cathedral image woodcut for the cover of the Bauhaus program ties to the spiritual values previously elevated by Der Blaue Reiter, and to a centuries-old German symbol of Christian transcendence. The cathedral is depicted, however, through the modern aesthetics of Cubism, Futurism, Expressionism, and the Russian-related style of Réunism, to create a vertical, semi-abstract composition. The November 1922 watercolor Study for Betonte Ecken, accentuated corners, reflects in Kandinsky's work a transition from the artist's earlier use of colors as symbolic of spiritual states to a focus in Kandinsky's work on the interrelationships of austere geometric shapes and their colors. Composed within a square format, the work balances the surging spear-like shaft upwards to the right against a rainbow cross pattern. Organic shapes throughout seem to burst outwards, and the shifting tans to brown anchor the composition. The creation of the 1925 painting in our collection, Portrait of the Lawyer Hugo Simons, can be attributed to the respect Otto Dix must have had for this attorney, who had recently defended and won a court case in the artist's favor. This remarkable drawing was made as a presentation sheet for Dr. Simons, descending through the family in Canada, where they fled to escape the Nazis. Executed in charcoal, the richness of the shading tonalities is immediately evident. The artist is still working on the contours of the subject's thick head of hair, with no evidence of the later waves, and the final painting very much reduces the forehead creases. The shading across the face is much more accentuated in the drawing. Gone are the attributes that tie Simons to his profession. The position of the lawyer's hands become the sole indication of his calling, and the portrait's most distinctive and telling feature. Simons seems to be emphasizing a point of law. It is appropriate to conclude this exhibition with the work of Georg Baselitz. In 1969, the artist began depicting his subjects upside down to overcome representational content and focus on the two-dimensional, arbitrary compositional order of painting and printmaking, while retaining the reference to figural imagery. His sources are multiple, including African art, the abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. While he has denied a direct influence from German expressionist art, a parallel to the style and concerns of the early 20th century movement, Die Brücke, also presented in this exhibition, has long been noted. Furthermore, he clearly looked back to earlier artists, including Dürer, and primitive German woodcuts. The presentation of trees as a semi-mystical environment has a long history in German printmaking, going back to the early 16th century, as presented in this exhibition in works by Altdorfer. Baum, tree, which presents trees in a winter landscape inverted, also alludes to the devastation in post-World War II Germany. With its desolate landscape reference, the haunting greenish tonality of the background furthers the effect. The trees seem stunted, their branches barren. At the same time, however, they stand on the tips of their branches, and within this inverted order, the vertical shafts thrusting upwards suggest the possibility of regeneration. Remarkably, working in the medium of etching and aquatint, Baselitz suggests the aesthetic of a primitive woodcut.
Ich danke Ihnen und wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Besuch in der Ausstellung. I thank you very much and wish you a very enjoyable visit to the exhibition.